dinner dim, dinner dim dong, dinner dim, dinner dim dim get that dong, dinner dim dong, dinner dim that get that jun dong, dinner dim dong, dinner dim dong get that dinner dim dong.
What happened? What almost happened? What should have happened? Affects what is happening now. Impacts what hasn't even happened yet. Monuments that were spatially created. Monuments that were deliberately destroyed. Monuments that stood the test of time. Storytelling Education and Arts India Council presents MOM, Memoirs of Monuments. हमारी कहानी, हमारी धरोहर.
Good evening, everybody. At least good evening from this time. I'm going to talk about the monastery at Nalanda, and as I indicate here in the PowerPoint, the title is Nalanda, Interrogating Assumptions about the Great Buddhist Monastery. This talk examines some assumptions. I'm tempted even to call them myths about the Buddhist monastery at Nalanda as it existed and functioned during the 5th through 12th centuries, the period during which it flourished. With the present political climate in India, I think it especially important to investigate with care and caution some of the claims about institutions such as Nalanda, claims that were perpetuated as much by the colonial enterprise as by those seeking to add Nalanda to the UNESCO World Heritage List. But before I begin to examine the claims, let me try to situate Nalanda for those who don't know it well. One way of describing the location is to say that Nalanda is a little more than 80 kilometers south of Patna and about 12 kilometers north of Rajgir. But that only refers to the excavated site, the place enclosed by fencing to protect the site from potential thieves and to ensure that those who enter do so with proper tickets. There is good reason, however, to imagine that the great monastery extended well beyond the fenced enclosure. M.B. Rajni, for example, has suggested that all the tanks, that is, the small bodies of water, identified Nalanda's extent in ancient times, a notion that feels to me quite right after several times walking the periphery demarcated by these tanks. We might also ask, what was Nalanda? In the title of this talk, I refer to it as a great Buddhist monastery. So in a sense, I've told you already what I think it was. But many, including the proposal recently completed by the Archaeological Survey of India, nominating Nalanda as a World Heritage Site, describe Nalanda as a university. The inscriptions on seals and copperplate charters excavated at Nalanda invariably use the term Mahavihara, that is, great monastery, to describe Nalanda. That term, Mahavihara, however, tells us what a great monastery was and how it functioned. For that, we get some clues from the Chinese and Korean monks who spent time at Nalanda. We must remember, though, that they wrote their records upon returning to monasteries in their homeland, and so relied on memory for the report that they often had and that they often had a target audience, one that they hoped would see them as highly erudite, knowledgeable because they had been there, so to speak, in the place where the Buddha himself had walked, where the sacred texts were composed and preserved, and where learned masters provided daily exegesis on these texts. These monks from distant places provide just one perspective on Nalanda. There are other ways of documenting its histories. Inscriptions found in the course of excavation at Nalanda provide one other means of comprehending the history of the great monastery. And much energy, as well as a great deal of imagination, has been committed to reconciling the accounts of foreign monks with the inscriptional evidence, and of course the remains of the monuments, ruins as they are poignantly described in road signs leading to the site, as well as at the site itself, can be read for the considerable information they yield about Nalanda, both as a physical entity in the past and also as a functioning monastery. But in some, we have snippets of data through time, not a continuous history of the place. A statistician graphing data might smooth the curves and discard outliers. We, on the other hand, simply need to recognize that what we have and recognize that we can only see Nalanda at moments in its long history. Nalanda, the great monastery, was enormous, not only in the space it consumed, but also in the number of monks resident there. The ancient site within the present walls of Nalanda measures 488 by 244 meters. So if there were 3,000 monks at the monastery, as the 7th century pilgrim Yi Jing asserts, that would allow 39 square meters per monk, about the size of a generous hotel room. But that is using every square meter of the site, including the area comprising temples and the present grassy area. If the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang report that there were 10,000 monks at Nalanda, if it's anywhere near accurate, then the monks would have had only 11.9 square meters each, about the size of a typical monk's cell at Nalanda. That would be impossible unless the monks were sleeping in temples and in the open area, or if the 8 monasteries at the site had an enormous number of stories. Even for 3,000 monks, it would have been hugely crowded. The typical monastic dwelling at Nalanda has approximately 30 monk cells, each around a central courtyard, a total of 270 cells among the 8 dwellings that remain. To accommodate 3,000 monks, each monastic dwelling would need to be more than 11 stories high, a sort of pre-modern skyscraper without the lifts that made skyscrapers possible. To accommodate 10,000 monks, each dwelling would need to be 37 stories high. Then we need to think about the monks listening to discourses from learned masters, probably in the monastic dwellings, perhaps in front of the temples. Probably no more than 100 monks could actually hear a master without modern electronic amplification. More likely, only 50 monks gathered around a master could actually hear him. But even with 100 in rapt attention, that assumes 30 masters if there were 3,000 monks at Nalanda, and 100 masters if there were 10,000 monks. If we assume, on the other hand, that one master held forth in each of the monasteries, as implied by Xuanzang, that specific master was the reason the monks chose one monastic dwelling over another. And there are the remains of only 8 monastic dwellings. But can we imagine Nalanda as a university? The question is probably best asked by addressing what a university was like in the ancient world. The term university derives from the University of Bologna, founded in 1088, but chartered in 1158. Foreign students in Bologna, grouped by nationality, hired scholars to teach them, and in time formed a collective association binding together the students of diverse nationalities, thus creating a universitas, the origin of the term university. The initial curriculum was devoted to canon law and civil law, subsequently adding medicine, philosophy, arithmetic, astronomy, logic, rhetoric, and grammar. At Nalanda, the curriculum, if that is what it may be called, was considerably more focused on religious texts and their exegesis by learned monks. Most of what we know about Nalanda's curriculum we learn from Xuanzang's biographer, Hui Li, who sought to present his subject as a highly learned man and who was himself never at Nalanda. He writes that there were 1,000 men who could explain 20 collections of sutras and shastras, 500 who could explain 30 collections, and only 10 who could expound on 50 collections. Among those 10 was Xuanzang. Sukumar Dutt argues that monasteries, Nalanda included, provided a more liberal learning than Hui Li suggests. Citing the 14th century Buddhist writer Bustan, he notes that a good monk studies in order to help others and obtain knowledge by gaining knowledge of himself. Specifically, he studies logic, grammar, and literature, medicine, the arts, and metaphysics, according to Hui Li's Life of Xuanzang. Does that mean that these subjects were studied at Nalanda? There is no evidence that they were, nor evidence that they were not. Too often, however, the notion of a modern university is superimposed on Nalanda. Thus, one imagines that the success of the monks who had passed a rigorous interrogation regarding knowledge of Buddhist texts to gain entrance to Nalanda was tantamount to successfully passing an entrance examination to gain admission to a prestigious modern university. Once there, the image continues, the monks moved from class to class, studying diverse subjects rather than, as seems much more likely, listening intently to a master expound on a particular Buddhist text. In fact, one can imagine that each one of the monastic structures, quite visible among the remains at Nalanda, a master presided, and the monks lived in cells situated in close proximity to the master. Like all universities, the imagined Nalanda University had to have a library. Tibetan sources composed long after Nalanda was abandoned refer to an area of Nalanda known as the Dharmagunja that had 3 buildings comprising a library. From that snippet, much has been inferred. For example, many assume that the ideal described in a text of uncertain date but probably composed before the before the establishment of Nalanda, retains still at the site. The text, known as the Bhaskara Samhita, states that libraries should be finely built stone buildings, with each manuscript placed on metal shelves and covered with cloth. Some have even suggested, though it is not in the Bhaskara Samhita or any other ancient text, that there was a classification system for the library's manuscripts. And further, it has been suggested that the librarian in charge should be responsible for maintaining the texts and guiding students. Let us assume that there was at least a repository for manuscripts, if not a library in the modern sense. We still need to ask how the books were used. Were they read and studied, or were they an aid to memorization and internalization of the texts? Or were they treated as sacred objects themselves, much in the way that the works we art historians would call sculptures were understood and used? Perhaps, too, we should ask whether all those who used manuscripts understood them in the same way. Too often we think about Buddhism as a monolithic religion, without subtle, even bold distinctions among sects and in diverse parts of the world where Buddhism was and still is practiced. So even if Xuanzang traveled to India to seek accurate renditions of the texts, were the books that he and other Buddhist monks brought back to China, where there was a long-standing book tradition used in the same manner that books were used at monasteries in India. We almost certainly can assume that Nalanda did have a repository for manuscripts, both because we read that the Chinese pilgrims copied them, and also because there remain today several manuscripts whose colophons, Jinnah Kim notes, state that they were copied at Nalanda. Although a repository for manuscripts does not make it a library in the sense of a modern university library, it may not have been so different from the repository at Bologna or other European universities established before the time of printed books. One modern report goes so far as to proclaim excavations show how Nalanda University selected its vice chancellor. The article focuses on recent excavations at Khosrawan, which it says is on the periphery of Nalanda University's ruins. In fact, that's not so. It's 28 kilometers away. An inscription from Khosrawan, now in the Indian Museum in Kolkata, has been reread and shows that a monk at Khosrawan, probably the ancient site of Yashovarman Pura Vihara, was selected by decree of monks' assembly to serve as the Kulapati of Nalanda. It is a pretty big leap from Kulapati, that is, leader of the assemblage, to vice chancellor, a notion that starts with the assumption that Nalanda was a university in the sense of a modern academic institution. Scholarship is far better served by asking what the evidence shows and reviewing the evidence critically, rather than asking how data might support an assumption. In recent excavations at Telhara, about 32 kilometers north of Nalanda, have yielded the site of a Buddhist monastery. Much of the work on Telhara seeks to relate it to Nalanda. For example, a seal discovered in the course of the recent excavations shows a wheel flanked by recumbent deer, the very motif used on the Nalanda seal leading one writer to conclude that Telhara was, quote, another great seat of learning besides Nalanda and Adantapur. So committed to the notion that this monastery, like Nalanda, would be conceived as a university, with the article that identifies monastic cells as, would you believe, faculty quarters. And quotes Atul Kumar Verma, Director for Archaeology for the state of Bihar, as speculating, quote, since the excavations suggest that Telhara might have been a contemporary of Nalanda, it is quite possible that it was either an independent university for specialized education, or that students graduating from Nalanda University would come here for specialized study. Beside the 7th century Chinese monks, Xuanzang and Yijing, records show a significant number of monks from distant places who traveled to Nalanda, as well as Nalanda monks who traveled considerable distances beyond India. The claim, however, that Nalanda attracted monks, students as they were called when portraying Nalanda as if it were a modern university, from Japan, Indonesia, Persia, and Turkey, in addition to monks who in fact did come from China, Korea, and Tibet. That is totally without evidence. The claim seems to be intended to support the notion of Nalanda in the guise of a modern university with substantial populations of international students. One Japanese monk may have tried unsuccessfully to visit Nalanda, while another may have actually gotten there, though the record is unclear. Prince Takaoka, son of the emperor, the Japanese emperor, became a monk, leaving for India in 866 and apparently en route to Nalanda. But as the story goes, he was eaten by a tiger when the ship stopped somewhere in present-day Malaysia. Another report from a Chinese source refers to Kongo Sanma visiting a monastery in Middle India, where he saw things belonging to Xuanzang. This record has been used by some to argue that at least one Japanese monk was at Nalanda, although the Chinese source does not mention Nalanda by name. Does any of that make Nalanda a university? Yeah, yes, so long as we don't imagine it as an institution of higher learning in the modern sense. But in all the seals and copper plates excavated at the site, Nalanda is called a Mahavihara, a great monastery. It is never described as a Vidyalaya, a school or seat of learning. That is, the donors saw it as a monastery, even if we might superimpose on Nalanda the idea of a university. So what is Nalanda? Nalanda is more than an archaeological site enclosed by boundary walls. I mean that both in the physical and geographical sense, as well as the social and economic connections. Besides the well-ordered monastic dwellings facing the east-oriented temples, there are mounds beyond the walls that offer tantalizing opportunities to uncover still more information. For example, about the extent of the monastery itself. Outside the walls, there are sculptures too, that probably once were part of the monastic establishment. Some, for example, reside in Bargaon village. Others are in the surrounding area. For example, this huge seated Buddha close to Jagdishpur a village that is frequented by both pilgrims and art historians. Just as Nalanda was intimately linked to the surrounding area in ancient times, so once again today, Nalanda provides an economic and social and intellectual pivot for the surrounding communities. Visitors to the site spend money locally, not just to procure a ticket, but also to eat snacks or meals, and often to stay overnight at hotels that have been developed in the area. And the staff associated with the maintenance of the site live nearby, contributing in material ways to the economy of the region. What about the excavated site as it appears today? 3 east-oriented temples, of which little but the lowermost part remains, face the remains of 8 monastic dwellings. I say some 8 because 1, usually numbered Monastery 5, is really just an extension of one of the other structures. In addition to the tall structure at the site's southern end, and usually called the stupa of Site 3, and 2 monastic dwellings oriented rather differently from the 8 that comprise the excavated area. In addition to this tall structure, at the site's southern end, 2 other monastic dwellings oriented rather differently from the other 8 are comprise the excavated area. I stress excavated area because there are traces, however faint, of other structures, particularly on the site's north side, beyond the fence, where today Bargaon village is situated, possibly covering parts of Nalanda. And rather importantly, there are 2 temples located to the east of the present fenced, ticketed area. One of these 2 temples is called the Temple of Site 2, a product of the later part of the 7th century. Little of the temple's elevation remains, although architectural fragments found there suggest that it was a North Indian style temple with the characteristic towering superstructure crowned by a fluted disc known as an amalaka. If these fragments, all works in stone, are sufficient to suggest that the entire temple was a stone structure, not brick like that of all of Nalanda's other monuments, then it is certainly unique for this site. Indeed, for all Eastern India at this time. Excavations close to the temple are very much in order. The plinth, again, stone, is adorned with some 220 sculptures in a continuous band of keyhole-shaped niches separated from one another by pilasters. Although many assume that the subject matter of several panels indicates that this was a Hindu temple, in fact, the evidence is not really conclusive. Of the 220 panels, only 22 have been identified as depicting Hindu subjects. And even those are not exclusive to a Hindu context. The identity of some of these 22 is not as clear as often assumed. For example, a pot-bellied figure holding a money bag, generally taken as Kubera, or a woman with a child, commonly identified as Yashoda, with Krishna. Some of the reliefs almost certainly depict scenes from the great epics, the Mahabharata or Ramayana, such as one showing Ravana with Sita. But the epics should be understood as Indian, not the exclusive domain of one sect or another. And in any event, epic scenes are common to the plinths of temples. For example, the early 6th century Vishnu temple at Deogar. The god Skanda is depicted in one relief. But this deity is not uncommon in Buddhist contexts. For example, in the Krishna art of Mathura and Gandhara. And a passage in the Buddhist text, the Sadhanamala, is devoted to a description of this god. One relief does almost certainly depict Shiva. But Shiva too may be seen in a Buddhist context, for example, on a composite image of Shiva and Lokeshvara, dating to the 8th century, now in the Ashutosh Museum in Kolkata. The majority of figures on this temple plinth, however, are frolicking beings, ones whose identity probably never was intended to be specifically determined. To these we may add, to those who see the temple as a Hindu structure, its location outside of the core of Nalanda, as defined by the rows of temples and monastic dwellings, makes this sectarian identification seem to present little problem. One recent publication on Nalanda, for example, discusses this temple in a chapter on other monuments, not the chapter on Nalanda's temples, and cites the stone panels on the temple's plinth as evidence for the Brahmanical nature of this temple. And certainly the best scholarship on the temple by two giants of Indian art history, Krishnadeva and V.S. Agrawala, suggests that the temple was dedicated to Shiva because several of the images on the plinth, they say, they say illustrate this deity. That reasoning, however, is not convincing. The temple and other works located outside the core area were still within the monastic domain and should be seen as part of Nalanda. Even if it was not in ancient times part of Nalanda Mahavihara, there's no compelling reason to imagine a very large, prominent Hindu temple abutting monasteries 7 and 8. In fact, one scholar has suggested with compelling evidence that the figures on the temple plinth formed the outer circle of a Buddhist mandala, a circle inhabited by Hindu deities. Ultimately, it is probably safest to think of the sculptures on the plinth as Indian rather than in more narrow sectarian terms, drawing a clear divide as we do in modern times between Hinduism and Buddhism. Deities were and still are not the exclusive domain of one religious sect. The great monument of site number 3 is Nalanda's iconic monument, mostly because it is by far the tallest structure remaining, but also because in its present state, it is adorned with magnificent stucco sculptures. I say present state because the structure had some 7 stages of construction, each one enveloping the earlier one. The stucco sculptures are on the monument's 5th integument, the one most clearly revealed. More on the stucco sculptures in a moment. But first, what is this tall monument? Often it is said to be the stupa, that is, the reliquary mound of Sariputra, one of the Buddha's closest followers. According to Xuanzang, Sariputra died in the town of Kalapinaka about 30 li in Xuanzang's terms, 15 kilometers in ours, from Nalanda. The legend of King Ashoka, the Ashokavadana, as it is called in Sanskrit, a text in Chinese that purports to be a translation of the Sanskrit original. However, places his death at Shravasti, as does the life of Sariputra, yet another text. Shravasti is about 550 kilometers from Nalanda. Each text claims a stupa for Sariputra at the site of his death. Still other texts claim his death in a village called Nalaka, which is taken by many using sounds-like linguistics as Nalanda. In a great leap from that, the iconic monument at the excavated site at Nalanda is claimed to be Sariputra's stupa. The structure is often called Stupa 3, though in the absence of evidence that it's a stupa, I prefer to call it the Great Monument of Site 3. In a small village of Sarelchak, immediately across from Nalanda's excavated site, is a temple with a painted sign proclaiming that it marks the birthplace of Sariputra. Again, this is mostly a case of sounds-like linguistics. That is, there is a sense that Sariputra was born and died somewhere in the vicinity of Nalanda, and this village has a name that sounds as if it is related to Sariputra's name. The stucco images, many of them damaged in the course of a nighttime theft during the 1970s, depict only images of the Buddha and diverse bodhisattvas, many of them among Nalanda's most magnificent sculptures. I'm struck now, as I was when I first visited Nalanda, by the resemblance of these stucco images to works of the 5th century at Sarnath, as if when new resources were available at Nalanda, the descendants of much earlier Sarnath artists were imported to do the work. But the bigger question, it seems to me, is the extent to which these sculptures were placed in a programmatic order, or were they simply placed in random order? Looking at the sculptures repeatedly, I can see no rationale for the arrangement. The only distinction might be the prevalence of bodhisattva figures close to the stairs and Buddha figures arranged in a row beyond these. Might the experience of ascending the stairway have served as a rudimentary model for the hugely sophisticated monument at Borobudur on Java, where the ascent starts with scenes of the Buddha's life in previous lives, and then moves to the quest of Sadhana, who commences a pilgrimage at the suggestion of the Bodhisattva Manjushri, and finally at the highest level leads to the Buddha himself, enshrined within 72 stupas, whose lattice work makes him only partially visible. Since we don't know what originally was at the summit of Nalanda's great monument, or have any sense of how these images might have adorned the higher levels of this integument walls, we would be forcing a guess at best. But surely some experience was intended by the monk's ascent to the great monument's summit, perhaps one enhanced by visual imagery. Perhaps, however, the several images of Manjushri among the stucco figures allude to the Ganda Vyuha, the text that serves as the basis of the Borobudur structures. What do the many loose sculptures excavated at Nalanda tell us about the monastery? In truth, not a great deal. Today, most of the sculptures are housed in the Nalanda Museum, where the labels treat them as archaeological specimens, proclaiming their iconography and date, but not much more than that. They give no sense of context. They rarely specify the specific location within the excavated site that yielded the sculpture. And there's no sense of how the sculptures might have functioned for the monks residing there. I doubt seriously that Nalanda was much more or less a field of sculptures. Rather, I imagine, and imagination does need to be one of the art historian's primary tools, that they were either in small shrines within larger temples, or even if they were that housed massive in temples that housed massive stucco imagery. I base this in part on the practice in Eastern India today, where images are frequently placed on a ledge within the temple. Assuming that modern practice follows ancient tradition is fraught with problems I fully recognize, not least among them promoting the notion of India as timeless and unchanging culture. That's a notion that almost certainly is not true. Another possibility is that they were placed on in niches on the exterior of brick temples, replicating stucco images that previously adorned these shrines. Nalanda's stone sculptures, like those in much of Eastern India, almost surely date after the 8th century, when stucco sculpture seems to have gone out of fashion, likely because a more durable material, that is stone, became available. The bronze images, like the stone sculptures, date almost exclusively to the 8th century or later. Even though labels at the Nalanda Museum don't say so, every one of them was found at the site of a monastic dwelling, suggesting the possibility that they were the personal possession of monks, maintained in individual cells. That likely means that the monks had sufficient resources to commission the bronze sculptures. The only alternative I can imagine is that they were arranged within a monastic dwelling in some sort of programmatic order, perhaps in relation to the seated Buddha generally enshrined in the dwelling's rear wall, the monks' cells forming the rest of the perimeter. Finally, I want to examine Nalanda's demise. Almost every writer on Nalanda attributes the end of the monastery to the invasion of Qutbuddin Aibak's Afghan military commander, Bakhtiyar Khalji, in about 1193, or more generally to Muslim iconoclasm. It is certainly safe to say that Buddhism in India, flourishing as a major religion, rather precipitously seems to have vanished as a significant question about the very time of Bakhtiyar Khalji's invasion. But we need to separate the account of his attack from the rhetoric that swirls around Nalanda's demise, generally cast in Islamophobic terms. The report on Bakhtiyar Khalji's invasion comes from Minhaj al-Siraj's General History of the Mohammedan Dynasties of Asia. There he notes that in 1193, Bakhtiyar Khalji organized an attack on the fortified city of Bihar, probably present-day Bihar Sharif. He reports that most of the inhabitants were Brahmins, whose heads were shaven, and all of them were killed. Within the fortress, where these slain Brahmins were, there were many books, and upon inquiry, Bakhtiyar learned, quote, that the whole of the fortress and city was a college, and that a college is called a Bihar, likely a Vihara, a monastery. Manoj says that two soldiers who participated in the attack provided him with information. He was not there, so it is certainly not a first-hand account. Based on his report, however, most writers assume that Bakhtiyar went on to sack Nalanda, and that the monks there fled or were killed. They further assume that the destroyed library, if in fact Nalanda had a library, was burned. But what exactly does Manoj mean when he refers to an attack on the fortified city of Bihar? If it is present-day Bihar Sharif, then the monastery that Bakhtiyar sacked most likely was Ugandapur, the monastery probably beneath modern-day Bihar Sharif, although its precise location has never been established. If Bakhtiyar sacked a monastery in or near Bihar Sharif, then he may have gone on to sack Nalanda, although no such claim is ever made by a pre-modern writer. In any event, Bakhtiyar Khalji's military incursions into Bihar and on to Bengal certainly destabilized the region. And that in turn would have made it very difficult for Buddhist monasteries, Nalanda included, to maintain their way of life and their dependence on the surrounding region for goods and services. It also would have ended support it had received from the Pala dynasty kings. So even if there was no direct attack on Nalanda, the monastery almost certainly suffered irretrievably from this invasion. Despite the impact on religious institutions, we must realize that iconoclasm and religious persecution were not the motivating factors stimulating Bakhtiyar and his forces. Rather, like almost any military action in the pre-modern world, the goal was the acquisition of land and plunder. In all of this, I don't want to overlook Nalanda as a living site, one populated by monks, ringing with the sound of voices, fragrant from cooking food, and visually enhanced by the monks' garments, cloth banners waving, and the paint that must have enhanced the stucco-covered sculptures. The written record unearthed at Nalanda, seals, inscriptions chiseled on stone slabs, and still longer inscriptions on copper plates, are almost exclusively royal records. The seals probably were attached to legal documents such as the gift of land or endowment funds. The longer inscriptions also record gifts to the monastery. We lack, however, the voice of Nalanda's occupants themselves. That does not mean they failed to write, but rather the monsoon climate probably destroyed everyday writing, quite different from the arid climate in Egypt and West Asia, where letters and other jottings written on clay and papyrus, and even on vellum or paper, provide a picture of individual human beings, sometimes, like the Nalanda monks, far from home. We lacked then the voice of a monk communicating with his parents, or logs that might tell us what food was provided in the monastery, or any other sense of the everyday. That is, one reason we cling too uncritically and with such hope and expectation to the writing of foreign monks who spent time at Nalanda. Sometimes as the monastery flourished, sometimes expressing dismay at the state of its destruction and decay. Does that mean no monk resident at Nalanda ever committed personal thoughts to a mission? The records may be lost to the climate, as I suggested. But it may be that that oral communication almost invariably trumped written communication, except in the case of legal documents that might need to be verified to claim property or income. So perhaps instead of imagining lost letters, we might instead imagine a monk telling another monk who is about to set out from Nalanda that if he should see his parents or siblings, if he passed that way, and to assure them of the well-being of their learned and devoted son, devoted both to family and to study, and to the Sangha life to which he has committed. I would be very happy to have you email me comments or questions. The email is Asher, A-S-H-E-R, @umn.edu. Thank you for your attention.